June 1, 1944. Off the coast of southern England. The channel stretched gray and endless beneath a low-hanging fog, waves churning like an angry beast. On the blustery decks of the harbor at Portsmouth, engineers hunched over blueprints the size of dining tables, chalk dust flying in the wind. They were proposing something no one had ever built, a floating harbor that could carry the weight of an entire invasion, a city on water, anchored where the Nazis believed nothing could survive. Mulberry Harbors, someone whispered, almost afraid to say it out loud. Major General Sir Frederick Morgan shook his head, frowning at the drawings. "It's madness," he muttered, voice barely audible over the crashing surf. You can almost feel the disbelief in the officer's eyes. Concrete caissons, floating roadways, enormous blockships sunk as breakwaters. They looked like toys. Toys meant to face the fury of the Atlantic. Everyone laughed. But the engineers didn't flinch. They had spent years testing in secret, towing massive structures across the Thames estuary, dropping massive concrete blocks into the channel, timing tides, and calculating every shift in wind and current. "It's the only way," said civil engineer Guy Maunsell, his hands trembling as he pointed to the models. "Without this, the landings will stall before they even begin." The skepticism was palpable. British officers shook their heads, American planners muttered doubts, and even Winston Churchill raised an eyebrow. "You would have us believe we can float a city?" he asked during a meeting in Whitehall, cigar smoke curling around the question like a challenge. And yet, in that moment, there was a strange tension, an almost invisible thread that hinted this fantasy might just tip the scales of the entire war. Beneath the fog and mockery, the first caissons were being towed toward the channel. Steel groaned, ropes strained, and crews prayed as the structures bobbed violently in the waves. You can almost hear the pounding hearts, the whispered doubts, the silent prayers that these floating giants wouldn't capsize before reaching the shore. And no one knew the biggest test was yet to come. June 5, 1944, just past midnight. The English coast had disappeared into darkness, only the distant glow of searchlights and lanterns marking the edges of a restless sea. On board the tugs and landing craft, men clutched the rails, the wind slicing through coats and gloves as if daring them to falter. The Mulberry caissons, huge hollow concrete blocks, some taller than a 5-story building, creaked and groaned with every swell. You can almost feel the spray lashing your face, the salt stinging your eyes, the relentless Atlantic testing every seam and joint. Lieutenant Commander Henry Wilson barked orders, voice barely audible over the wind. "Steady, steady, keep her aligned with the tow." Behind him, young sailors clung to ropes, soaked to the bone, knowing that a single miscalculation could send months of effort to the bottom. Meanwhile, engineers huddled in the hold, maps spread across wet benches, calculating tide tables down to the minute. Every decision mattered. Every second mattered. The channel was alive with sound. Boats creaking, steel hitting steel, the low rumble of waves colliding with floating caissons. And then the first gust hit, sudden and violent, tipping a caisson dangerously. For a heart-stopping moment, it seemed as if the entire project might fail before it even began. Officers froze. Sailors gasped. Engineers whispered fervent prayers under their breath. Yet somehow, against all odds, the floating giants righted themselves. Inch by inch, mile by mile, they advanced toward the Normandy coast, guided by navigation lights and sheer human determination. On the shore, reconnaissance boats reported every sway, every movement. Even the skeptics, those who had laughed at the very idea of a floating harbor, began to feel a creeping sense of awe. Could this madness actually work? Could they truly build a city on water under enemy fire? Just as the first light of dawn stretched across the horizon, painting the waves gold, something extraordinary began to happen. Small craft began linking the caissons together, forming rigid platforms, floating roads, and docking points. The impossible was taking shape. And yet no one could foresee the storm brewing just a few days later, a storm that would either prove the Mulberry Harbors' genius or destroy it entirely. June 6, 1944. Dawn broke over Omaha Beach, Normandy. Smoke, fire, and the deafening roar of artillery filled the air. You can almost smell the cordite, taste the salt, Feel the grit under your fingernails as soldiers scrambled through mud and blood. Across the churning waters, something extraordinary was waiting, a harbor that no one believed could exist. From the deck of the HMS Centaur, officers peered through binoculars at the Mulberry components now floating in formation off the shore. Massive phoenix caissons, some over 60 feet tall, formed the backbone of a harbor that could anchor the massive flow of men and machinery. Roadways of floating steel planks stretched toward the beaches like the skeleton of a bridge to victory. Spitfires and C-47s circled overhead, their engines a constant reminder of the stakes below. Engineers, soaked and exhausted, oversaw the linking of each segment. Tugs pushed, cranes lifted, cables tightened. Every man knew a single mistake could collapse the fragile network and trap hundreds of men on the beaches. But the mockery of months passed, the laughter of officers who called it impossible, was replaced with tense wonder. Could these floating roads really handle tanks, artillery, and trucks? Could they withstand the fury of the Channel and the threat of German fire? Then came the first real test. Liberty's ships laden with fuel, ammunition, and supplies edged toward the docks. The platforms groaned under the weight, steel bending, water sloshing over the edges, but they held. Inch by inch, trucks rolled off the docks and onto the beaches. Soldiers cheered, engineers exhaled, even the doubters whispered, "It's working." Yet this victory came with a shadow. Weather reports predicted violent storms within days, a tempest that could tear apart the artificial harbor before it reached full capacity. And if that happened, the entire invasion could stall, leaving thousands trapped on hostile shores. The stakes could not have been higher. June 19, 1944. The Channel had turned black and roiling, waves slamming into each other like hammers on steel. You can almost hear the wind screaming, ripping tarps and ropes from the hands of sailors. The Mulberry Harbor, once a symbol of audacious engineering, now trembled under nature's wrath. Concrete caissons rocked violently, floating roadways twisted, and cables groaned as if screaming in protest. Captain James Latham of the Royal Navy barked orders over the storm's roar. "Secure the Phoenix blocks, reinforce the piers, don't let them shift." Men slipped on wet steel, mud and seawater spraying across their faces, hearts hammering. Every swell threatened to break the carefully linked harbor apart. One wrong move, one snapped rope, and months of planning would sink beneath the waves, along with thousands of tons of supplies. But the engineers had prepared for this. Guy Maunsell and his team had designed the Mulberry Harbor to flex, to bend, to survive forces that seemed impossible. Still, nothing could fully account for the sheer power of a Channel storm. Half the western Mulberry at Omaha Beach was ripped apart in hours, steel twisted, caissons smashed. Yet the eastern Mulberry at Gold Beach, thanks to careful anchoring and a bit of luck, held firm, a testament to human ingenuity against nature's fury. As dawn broke after the storm, the scene was surreal. Parts of the harbor were gone, lost to the sea. Yet where it survived, trucks, tanks, and troops rolled across floating roads as if nothing had happened. Engineers wiped salt and sweat from their faces, realizing that their madness had endured where conventional wisdom said it would fail. But the greatest shock was yet to come. From the air, reconnaissance pilots reported something that no one had fully anticipated. The Germans, convinced that the Allies would falter without proper ports, had failed to mount an organized counterattack against the surviving Mulberry. In other words, the floating harbor had turned doubt into strategy, laughter into awe, and now it was about to prove that it could sustain an army in ways the enemy had never imagined. June 21, 1944. The sun glinted off steel, waves now calmer but still restless, and the surviving Mulberry at Gold Beach stretched across the Channel like a miracle of human ingenuity. You can almost hear the clatter of trucks rolling over steel planks, the roar of engines as Sherman tanks crossed the floating roadways, and the shouts of soldiers unloading crates of ammunition, rations, and artillery. For weeks, the harbor had been a silent hero, carrying thousands of tons of supplies to the beaches every day. Liberty ships docked alongside floating piers that once seemed laughable. Engineers ran from caisson to caisson, welding, tightening, reinforcing, their hands blackened with grease, their eyes sharp for the slightest crack. Each segment had to bear the weight of tanks, trucks, and men, all while withstanding tides that threatened to tear it apart. Meanwhile, from the air, RAF reconnaissance pilots spotted the full scale of the operation. 2,000 Allied aircraft took off from nearby airstrips, ferrying paratroopers, supplies, and bombers across the French countryside. The Mulberry Harbor had done what no one dared imagine. It had created a floating city, a staging ground for an invasion of Europe, right under the noses of the Germans. Generals who had mocked the project watched from command posts, their disbelief giving way to awe. Major General Morgan wrote in his log, "What seemed impossible has not only survived, it thrives. The harbor carries our hopes, our weapons, and our men faster than any port could." Even Winston Churchill reportedly leaned over a map and murmured, "Remarkable," they laughed, "and yet here it is, defying the seas themselves." But as the Allies celebrated, intelligence reports hinted at the next challenge. German forces were regrouping, launching artillery strikes at the beaches, hoping to destroy the fragile lifeline. The harbor was more than steel and concrete now. It was a living, breathing artery for an invasion that could determine the fate of the continent. And the question lingered, could it survive the coming assault, or would months of labor be swept away in a single night of fire and fury? June 25, 1944. From the cliffs above the Normandy coast, German commanders peered through binoculars at the sprawling harbor that had appeared almost overnight. You can almost hear the muttered curses as they observed Liberty ships docking with ease, trucks rolling across steel roadways, and planes taking off in perfect formation. The mockery they had indulged in for months, the floating folly of the Allies, was now a deadly reality. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, already stretched thin defending against the Allied push, received urgent reports. "They are unloading tanks, artillery men, faster than our calculations allowed," one officer gasped. Another added, "It is as if the harbor grows with each tide. Impossible, unimaginable." Rommel rubbed his temples, realizing that conventional bombardment would have little effect on the massive, floating engineering marvel. Every shell fired from the shore risked missing, striking water and splintering harmlessly against reinforced caissons. Back at the harbor, engineers and soldiers worked tirelessly. Even under sporadic artillery fire, the Mulberry sections flexed and absorbed impacts, the ingenuity of Guy Maunsell's team proving its worth. You can almost feel the tension, the wind whipping across metal, men yelling over the roar of waves and cannon fire, and every bolt, cable, and plank holding the fate of thousands. This was no longer a test. It was a battle of human innovation against both enemy fire and the unforgiving sea. Meanwhile, Allied planners marveled at the scale. Supplies were pouring in at a rate previously thought impossible. The harbor had transformed the invasion from a precarious gamble into a sustained offensive, enabling troops to push inland with unmatched speed. The Germans, for all their experience, had underestimated not only the Allies' determination, but the sheer audacity of building a city on water. And yet, even as all replaced disbelief, a chilling realization spread among the Allied officers. The harbor was brilliant but fragile. One misstep, one storm, one concentrated attack could undo it all. Could this floating city continue to sustain the invasion, or would the Germans find a way to turn mockery into catastrophe? July 1, 1944. The morning sun reflected off the calm waters of the channel, but the threat was far from over. You can almost hear the low hum of engines, the clatter of metal on metal, and the distant rumble of artillery shells that sometimes still reached the beaches. The Mulberry Harbor had survived both storm and skepticism, and now it had become the lifeblood of the Allied push into France. Soldiers and engineers moved in a synchronized rhythm. Sherman tanks rumbled across the floating roadways, trucks carrying ammunition and medical supplies rolled steadily, and cargo ships delivered reinforcements almost hourly. Pilots of Spitfires and C-47s lifted off from nearby airstrips, their engines drowning out all doubts. What was once considered an impossible dream had become a battlefield reality, and its success was measured in miles gained, lives saved, and towns liberated. On the cliffs above, German officers could only watch in stunned disbelief. The floating harbor, which they had mocked as an absurd stunt, now supported an army moving faster than any defense they could muster. Even Rommel, a master of maneuver warfare, admitted privately to his aides, "The Allies have turned steel and concrete into strategy. I never imagined such a thing possible." But the triumph carried tension. Engineers raced to maintain the integrity of every caisson, aware that fatigue, corrosion, and enemy artillery could still sabotage their work. Every bolt tightened, every plank reinforced, became a silent act of courage. And as Allied forces pushed deeper into Normandy, each successful crossing, each shipment delivered, only heightened the stakes. The harbor was no longer just a tool. It was a testament to human ingenuity under fire, a floating proof that audacity could defy both nature and man. Yet even in victory, a lingering question remained. Could this fragile marvel continue to sustain the Allies long enough to change the course of the war? Or was it merely a fleeting wonder, beautiful yet temporary, destined to vanish under the next storm or shelling? July 10, 1944. Gold Beach hummed with life. You can almost feel the energy, the metallic clank of trucks on steel roadways, the hiss of engines, the shouts of soldiers coordinating unloading operations. The Mulberry Harbor, once a joke whispered about in Whitehall and London pubs, now stretched like a steel-end concrete artery pumping life into the Allied invasion. Engineers stood atop caissons, wind whipping their hair, eyes scanning every joint and cable. They had built more than a harbor, they had built hope. Tanks crossed floating bridges as if the structure were solid land, artillery rolled along platforms that swayed with the tide, and supply convoys moved with precision that mocked months of doubt. Every Allied officer who had once laughed at the floating folly now walked the docks in silence, all replacing skepticism. From the air, reconnaissance pilots took photographs that would later become legendary. Thousands of troops, hundreds of vehicles, and countless tons of supplies moved in a perfectly coordinated ballet, all resting on this fragile engineered miracle. Even Winston Churchill reportedly leaned over a map at Southwick House, murmuring, "They mocked it, and yet here it is, an entire port afloat carrying the weight of victory." Yet beneath this triumph, tension lingered. Every storm could test the limits, every German counterattack could threaten collapse. The harbor had become the backbone of the invasion, but it remained an engineering gamble. Could human ingenuity continue to outpace nature and enemy fire? Could a city on water truly withstand the chaos of war? As trucks rolled endlessly off the piers and into Normandy, one thing was certain: the laughter was gone. Mockery had turned into awe, and somewhere in the minds of soldiers and engineers alike, a simple realization settled in. They had witnessed something no one thought possible, a floating city that had changed the course of history. August 1, 1944. Normandy was no longer a chaotic beachhead. It had become a launching pad for the liberation of France. You can almost hear the steady rhythm of trucks, the hiss of landing craft, the distant roar of fighter planes patrolling the skies above. And at the center of it all, the Mulberry Harbor still floated, a testament to human audacity and engineering brilliance. Engineers walked along the steel roadways, inspecting every joint and weld, their hands calloused and blackened from months of tireless work. Soldiers rolled Sherman tanks past, artillery pieces clanging, and trucks carrying essential supplies never stopped. The harbor had proven itself in both storm and battle, transforming what had been a logistical nightmare into a lifeline. The Germans had underestimated it, the skeptics had mocked it, and yet here it was, delivering thousands of tons of men and material every day. Historians would later call the Mulberry Harbors one of the greatest feats of wartime engineering, a blend of audacity, precision, and necessity. But for the men on the ground, it was more than engineering. It was survival. It was momentum. It was proof that human innovation, courage, and determination could turn the tides of war. And as Allied forces pushed further into occupied France, the floating harbors continued to serve as arteries of liberation, carrying men, machines, and hope. The laughter of those who once called it impossible had long vanished, replaced by the silent awe of those who witnessed it in action. The harbor had become more than concrete and steel. It had become legend. August 15, 1944. The sun rose over Gold Beach, sparkling on the calm waters of the channel. You can almost hear the hum of activity, trucks rolling off the floating piers, tanks' rumbles echoing across the harbor, soldiers shouting orders over the din. The Mulberry Harbor, once called a folly, a fantasy, and a madman's dream, had endured storms, artillery, and doubt to become the lifeblood of the invasion. Engineers, sailors, and soldiers moved in perfect coordination, a living testament to audacity under fire. Every bolt tightened, every cable secured, every plank reinforced told a story of determination against impossible odds. Churchill's whispered words, "Remarkable," now echoed in the hearts of everyone who had risked everything to build it. Allies marveled at its scale and resilience, while German commanders could only watch, stunned into disbelief. The laughter had long faded, replaced by respect, silent, grudging, but absolute. The harbor's legacy was already clear. It had allowed tens of thousands of troops to push inland, deliver crucial supplies, and maintain momentum that might otherwise have stalled. It had turned mockery into awe, fantasy into strategy, and audacity into reality. And beyond the battle, it became a symbol that even amid war's chaos, human ingenuity, courage, and vision could defy the impossible. As the last Liberty ship slipped off the piers that evening, the channel calm and golden under the fatting sun, one thought lingered in every mind present. They had witnessed history, floating above the waves, daring the impossible. And for the first time, the world truly understood that what had once been mocked could change the course of nations.